The bucket handle had worn grooves into Zelda Kane's palms so deep they might never smooth out again. And as she stood at the creek's edge watching the sunset paint the water copper and gold, she wondered if this would be the walk that finally broke her. 2 miles. 4 miles round trip. Twice a day, every day, for the past 8 months since her father had died and left her alone in that little cabin on the edge of Holbrook, Arizona. The year was 1882, and the desert didn't care about a 22-year-old woman trying to survive on her own with nothing but stubbornness and blistered hands. The town had a well in the center, but her father had built their home far out on the eastern edge, wanting privacy and space for the horses he'd planned to breed. Those plans died with him when his heart gave out last winter, and Zelda had sold the horses one by one just to buy flour and beans and coffee. She filled both buckets, the water sloshing cold against her skirts, and began the long walk back as twilight settled over the scrubland. The weight pulled at her shoulders, made her back ache in ways that reminded her she was alone in this world. Her mother had died bringing her into it, and now her father was 6 feet under in the Holbrook cemetery. She had no siblings, no aunts or uncles who'd claimed her. Just the cabin, the land, and these 2 buckets that might as well have been iron chains. The first stars were emerging when she saw the figure near her cabin. Zelda's heart jumped into her throat, and she set down the buckets, her hand instinctively moving to the small knife at her belt. Drifters and worse came through these parts. A woman alone was an invitation for trouble, but as she got closer, she could see him more clearly in the fading light. He was tall, built solid like men who worked with their hands, wearing a dusty brown hat and a vest over a worn shirt. His horse, a sturdy roan, was tied to her fence post. He wasn't at her door, though. He was standing about 20 feet from it, staring down at the ground like he was reading something written in the dirt. "You're on my property," Zelda called out, keeping her voice steady despite the fear threading through her chest. The man looked up, and even in the dimness she could see his face was young, maybe 26 or 27, with a few days of stubble on his jaw and eyes that reflected the last light of day. He pulled off his hat, holding it against his chest in a gesture that seemed automatic, respectful. "Yes, madam, I know. I'm sorry for the intrusion. Name's Thomas Walsh. I've been working at the Patterson Ranch about 5 miles west of here." He had a low, quiet voice, the kind that made you lean in to listen. "I've seen you making that walk to the creek, twice a day most days." Heat rushed to Zelda's face, though she couldn't say if it was embarrassment or anger. "So you've been watching me." "Not watching. Just noticing. Hard not to notice when someone's carrying that much hardship on their shoulders." He gestured to the buckets she'd left on the path. "That's got to be 4 miles round trip. 2 miles to the creek, 2 miles back," Zelda said, lifting her chin. "I manage just fine. I'm sure you do." Thomas turned his hat in his hands, and she noticed they were work-worn, calloused, the hands of a man who knew labor. "But I was thinking, if you'd allow it, I could dig you a well, right here close to your cabin, save you all that walking." Zelda stared at him. The offer was so unexpected, so strange, that for a moment she couldn't process it. "I don't have money to pay for a well. Didn't ask for money." "Then why would you do it?" Thomas looked at her directly then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. It wasn't predatory or calculating. It was just honest, maybe too honest. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I know what it's like to be alone and struggling. Lost my own folks 3 years back. If someone had offered me help when I needed it most, I'd have taken it." The night was settling in properly now, stars scattered across the sky like thrown salt. Zelda's shoulders ached, her hands throbbed, and she was so tired she could cry. But she'd learned to be suspicious of kindness. The world didn't give things freely. What do you want in return? Nothing. He put his hat back on. Just permission to dig. I've got some free days coming up. I know how to find water, learned from an old dowser back in Kansas. I've got the tools. You've got the need. Seems simple to me. Nothing simple. No, Thomas agreed, a small smile touching his mouth. I suppose not, but this could be. Zelda wanted to say no, wanted to send him away and prove she could handle everything herself. But pride was a cold companion on those long walks, and her body was wearing down from the constant strain. She thought of next summer, when the heat would be even more brutal, when the creek might run lower, and she'd have to walk even farther to find good water. You dig it right there. She pointed to where he'd been standing. How do you know there's water? Feel it in my bones. My grandmother had the gift, passed it down through my mother to me. There's water here, not too deep. Maybe 20, 30 feet. I could have a well dug in a week, working mornings and evenings. A week. 7 days and she'd have water right outside her door. The thought was almost too wonderful to believe. All right, Zelda heard herself say. You can dig, but I'll feed you while you work. It's only fair. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, but I'm going to. That's my condition. Thomas smiled then, a real smile that changed his whole face, made him look younger and less worn down by the world. Yes, madam, I accept your terms. He left shortly after, riding off into the darkness, and Zelda retrieved her buckets and carried them the last stretch to her cabin. As she poured the water into her barrels inside, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake or if maybe, just maybe, something good was about to happen. Thomas arrived the next morning just after dawn, riding up with tools strapped to his saddle and a bedroll tied behind. Zelda had been up for an hour already, had made coffee and cornbread, and she brought some out to him as he was unloading a pickaxe and shovel. You weren't joking about feeding me, he said, accepting the tin cup of coffee gratefully. I don't joke much. Zelda handed him a cloth-wrapped piece of cornbread. There's butter on it, not much, but some. This is generous, thank you. He ate standing up, looking at the spot he'd chosen. I'll start digging this morning. Fair warning, it's going to be loud and dusty. I've lived through worse. And so he began. Zelda tried to go about her normal chores, tending to her small vegetable garden, mending a tear in her other skirt, cleaning the cabin. But she kept finding herself watching him through the window. Thomas worked with a steady rhythm, driving the pickaxe into the hard earth, shoveling out the loose dirt, creating a circular pit that grew deeper with each hour. He'd taken off his vest and rolled up his sleeves, and she could see the flecks of muscle in his arms and shoulders as he worked. By midday, he'd dug down about 4 feet. Zelda brought him water and more food, some dried beef and bread. He climbed out of the hole, dirt streaking his face and clothes, and sat in the small patch of shade from her cabin. You're making good progress, Zelda said, sitting a respectful distance away. Ground's not as hard as I feared. That's lucky. He drank deeply from the water dipper. How long have you been out here alone? 8 months. My father died last October. I'm sorry. So am I. Zelda looked out at the scrubland, the endless stretch of sage and dust and sky. He loved this place. I'm not sure I do, but it's all I have. You ever think about moving to town? Might be easier. I think about it, but the cabin's mine, the land's mine. If I leave, I lose it. And then what do I have? A job cleaning someone else's house or serving drinks in a saloon. At least here I'm my own person. Thomas nodded slowly. I understand that. It's worth something, being your own person. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the heat pressing down on them like a weight. Then Thomas stood, stretched his back, and climbed back into the hole to keep digging. Zelda went inside and tried not to think about how nice it had been, sitting with someone, talking to someone who wasn't judging her or pitying her. The days fell into a pattern. Thomas would arrive at dawn, work until midday, rest during the hottest hours while Zelda fed him lunch, then work until evening before riding back to the Patterson ranch. The hole grew deeper, 6 feet, then 8, then 10. He built a pulley system to haul up the dirt, and the pile beside the hole grew into a small mountain. On the third day, Zelda worked up the courage to ask him more about himself. They were sitting in the shade again, eating bean stew she'd made that morning. "You said you lost your folks 3 years ago. Where was that?" "Kansas. We had a farm, but a twister took the house and them with it. I was in town that day buying supplies, came back to nothing but splinters and silence." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the old pain underneath. "Sold what was left and started moving west. Worked ranches mostly. I'm good with horses, decent with cattle. The Pattersons are fair people, pay on time. It's honest work." "You plan to stay here in Hallbrook?" Thomas shrugged. "Haven't decided. I don't feel rooted anywhere anymore. It's like that twister picked me up too, and I'm still not sure where I'm supposed to land." Zelda understood that feeling more than she could say. "I feel like I'm barely holding on. Some days I think about walking away from all of it. Just leaving the cabin and the land and finding somewhere easier. But I'm stubborn, I guess." "Stubborn's not a bad thing. It keeps you alive." On the 5th day, Thomas hit water. Zelda was hanging laundry when she heard him shout, and she ran over to find him climbing out of the well, soaking wet and grinning like a boy who'd found a gold nugget. "Water," he laughed, shaking his head like a wet dog. "Sweet, cold water. I told you it was here." Zelda leaned over the edge and could see it, a dark pool at the bottom reflecting the circle of sky above. Relief flooded through her so intensely it made her dizzy. "You found it. You really found it. Told you I would." He was still grinning, droplets of water running down his face. "Now I need to line it with stones so the walls don't collapse and build a proper frame and pulley for the bucket. That'll take another 2 days, maybe 3. I can't believe it." Zelda felt tears prickling her eyes and blinked them back quickly. "I won't have to walk to the creek anymore." "No, madam. You've got water right here, right outside your door." Something broke loose in Zelda's chest, some tight knot of fear and exhaustion she'd been carrying for months. Before she could stop herself, she reached out and hugged him, wrapping her arms around his wet, dirt-covered body and holding on tight. He stiffened in surprise, then carefully, gently put his arms around her too. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." "You're welcome, Zelda." "You're very welcome." She pulled back, suddenly embarrassed by her display of emotion. Her dress was dirty now, marked with wet earth where she'd pressed against him. "I'm sorry, Don't apologize, it's all right." His voice was soft, and when she met his eyes, she saw something there that made her heart beat faster. Not pity, not charity. Something warmer, something that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. The next days, Thomas worked on lining the well with stones he hauled from a rocky outcrop half a mile away. Zelda helped when she could, carrying smaller rocks, handing him tools. They worked side by side, and she found herself watching his hands as he carefully placed each stone, fitting them together like a puzzle. He had patience, she noticed, not just with the work but with her. When she asked questions, he answered thoroughly. When she offered an opinion, he listened. On the 7th evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas finished building the frame. It stood solid and strong, a wooden structure with a pulley and rope and a bucket. He lowered the bucket down, drew it up full of clear, cold water and offered her the first drink. Zelda took it with shaking hands and sipped. The water tasted like a miracle, like freedom, like the future might not be as hard as the past had been. "It's perfect," she said. "Thomas, it's perfect. It'll serve you well for years. Decades, probably. You'll never have to make that walk again." He was gathering his tools, loading them back onto his horse, and Zelda realized with a sudden sharp pang that this was it. The well was done. He had no reason to come back. She'd see him in town maybe, tip her hat politely and keep walking. This strange, wonderful week would become a memory and she'd be alone again. "Thomas," she said before she could talk herself out of it, "would you stay for supper? A real supper, not just bread and beans. I've got a chicken I could roast, some potatoes. It's the least I can do to thank you properly." He paused in the act of tying down his tools, turned to look at her. I'd like that very much." So he stayed. Zelda cooked with more care than she had in months, seasoning the chicken with precious herbs from her garden, roasting the potatoes until they were golden and crispy. She set the table with her mother's dishes, the ones she almost never used because they were too fine for every day, and lit 2 candles because the sun had set and the cabin needed light. They ate slowly, talking about small things at first. The weather, the town, the ranch where Thomas worked. But as the meal went on and the candles burned lower, their conversation deepened. Thomas told her about growing up in Kansas, about his mother's garden and his father's laugh. Zelda told him about her father's dreams for this place, about how she sometimes talked to his grave in the cemetery, telling him about her days. "You think he'd be proud of you?" Thomas asked, leaning back in his chair. "For staying, for keeping the place going?" "I hope so. I think so. He was a stubborn man, so he'd probably understand why I won't give up." Zelda traced a finger along the rim of her coffee cup. "What about your parents? What would they think of you now?" "My mother would probably scold me for not writing to our relatives back east. My father would approve of the hard work, the honest living. They were good people. I try to live in a way that would make them proud." "I think you do. What you did for me, digging this well, that's the kind of thing good people do." Thomas met her eyes across the table. "I didn't do it just to be good, Zelda," her breath caught. "No, no." He stood up, came around the table, and held out his hand. "I did it because from the first time I saw you walking back from that creek, buckets weighing you down, I couldn't stop thinking about you. About how strong you must be, how determined. About how wrong it was that you were struggling like that with no one to help." Zelda took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. They were standing close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his brown eyes, could smell the soap he'd washed with before supper. "I'm not strong," she whispered. "I'm just too stubborn to quit." "That's the same thing." His other hand came up, cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "Zelda, I know it's only been a week. I know I've got no right, but I'd like to court you if you'd allow it. I'd like to come calling, proper-like, and see if maybe there's something here worth building on." She should say no, should protect herself, keep her walls up. But when was the last time someone had touched her with kindness? When was the last time she'd felt anything but lonely? "Yes," she said. "Yes, you can come calling." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious. Zelda's hands fisted in his shirt, holding him close, and for the first time in 8 months she didn't feel alone. Over the next weeks, Thomas came to visit whenever he could spare the time. Sometimes it was just an hour in the evening after his work at the ranch was done. Sometimes it was a full afternoon on his day off. He helped her with chores, fixed a broken fence rail, patched a hole in her roof. But mostly they just talked, learning each other in the way people do when they're building something new and fragile. Zelda learned that Thomas loved the stars, could name constellations, and tell the old stories about them. She learned that he had a scar on his left shoulder from being thrown by a green horse when he was 15. She learned that he sang, quietly, when he was working, and that his favorite food was apple pie even though he hadn't had any in more than a year. Thomas learned that Zelda could shoot, that her father had taught her, and she was better than most men. He learned that she was scared of thunder ever since a lightning strike had hit a tree near the cabin and nearly set the roof on fire. He learned that she loved to read but had only 3 books, and she'd read them each a dozen times. He started bringing her things. Not expensive things, because he didn't have much money either, but thoughtful things. A book he'd borrowed from the Patterson Ranch's library. A hair ribbon from the general store. A smooth stone from the creek that was shaped almost like a heart. Zelda treasured each gift, kept them in a small box under her bed like they were made of gold. 2 months after he'd finished the well, Thomas asked her to come to the town dance. Holbrook held one every 6 weeks or so in the church hall, and while Zelda had been to a few before her father died, she hadn't gone since. It hadn't seemed right, celebrating when she was grieving, and she'd had no one to dance with anyway. But when Thomas asked, his hat in his hands and his eyes hopeful, she couldn't say no. She wore her best dress, a deep blue one that her father had bought her for her 21st birthday, and twisted her dark hair up with the ribbon Thomas had given her. When he arrived to collect her in a borrowed wagon, his face lit up like she'd hung the moon. "You look beautiful," he said, helping her up onto the seat beside him. "You clean up pretty well yourself." He did. He'd shaved, put on a clean shirt and vest, and his boots were actually polished. As they rode toward town, the setting sun painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Zelda felt something unfamiliar bubbling up in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as happiness. The dance was already in full swing when they arrived. The church hall was packed with people from Holbrook and the surrounding ranches, everyone dressed in their finest. A fiddle player and a man with a guitar provided the music, and couples spun across the floor in patterns Zelda half remembered from before. Thomas led her into the crowd and they danced. He wasn't the smoothest dancer and she was rusty, but it didn't matter. What mattered was his hand at her waist, her hand in his, the way he smiled down at her like she was the only person in the room. Between dances, they stood at the refreshment table drinking punch, and various people came up to talk. Mrs. Henderson from the general store commented on what a nice couple they made. Mr. Patterson, Thomas's employer, shook Thomas's hand and told Zelda he was a lucky man to have such a good worker. A few younger women looked at Zelda with expressions that might have been envy or curiosity or both. "They're all talking about us," Zelda murmured to Thomas as they stepped outside for some air. "Let them talk. I'm not ashamed to be seen with you, neither am I. It's just strange being part of the town gossip." Thomas leaned against the church wall, pulling her gently to stand in front of him. "Does it bother you, the attention?" "No, maybe a little. I've been on my own for so long, I forgot what it's like to be part of things." She looked up at the stars scattered across the black sky. "But I like it. I like being here with you." "Good." He kissed her forehead, a tender gesture that made her feel cherished. "Because I plan to be here with you as much as you'll let me." By October, 4 months after Thomas had first appeared at her cabin, they were the talk of Holbrook. Everyone knew the story of how the cowboy had dug the well for the lonely woman on the edge of town. Some thought it was romantic. Others thought Thomas was foolish for working so hard for free. But no one could deny that Zelda looked happier than she had in over a year, and Thomas walked around with the air of a man who'd found something worth keeping. One evening, as they sat on the steps of Zelda's cabin watching the sunset, Thomas said, "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous." He smiled but didn't joke back. "I've been thinking about the future, about what I want. And the truth is, Zelda, I want you. I want this. I want to wake up and know you're beside me, go to sleep holding you. I want to build a life with you right here on this land." Zelda's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Thomas, I know I'm not rich. I've got some money saved, enough to buy some cattle and maybe expand your father's old corral. We could build this place into something real, a proper ranch. Small at first, but it would grow. We'd make it grow together." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Marry me, Zelda. Be my wife. Let me be your husband. Let me stay." She thought about the past months, the loneliness that had defined her life before he came. She thought about the well outside her door, the water she no longer had to carry. She thought about how he'd given her that gift freely, asking for nothing in return. And she thought about love, real love, the kind her parents must have had before her mother died too soon. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she didn't care. She held him back just as fiercely. This man who'd seen her struggling and decided to help, who'd stayed even after the work was done, who'd chosen her. They were married in November in the same church where they danced, with half of Hallbrook in attendance. Zelda wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and Thomas wore a new suit that he'd spent 2 months' wages on. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her like he was making a promise. The Pattersons hosted a reception at their ranch, and there was food and dancing and enough well wishes to last a lifetime. But the best moment came late in the evening when Thomas and Zelda finally left, riding back to the cabin that was now theirs together. Thomas carried her over the threshold, and Zelda laughed, breathless and giddy. He set her down gently in the middle of the room, and they looked at each other in the lamplight. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband." They came together like magnets, kissing deeply, urgently, all the restraint they'd maintained during their courtship falling away. Thomas was gentle with her, patient, making sure she felt safe and cherished. And when they finally came together fully, Zelda understood why people wrote poems about this, why they called it making love. Because that's what it was, a physical expression of everything they felt for each other. Afterward, they lay tangled in her small bed, now their bed, and Thomas stroked her hair while she traced patterns on his chest. "I never thought I'd have this," Zelda whispered. "I thought I'd grow old alone out here, fighting the land until it finally beat me. You're not alone anymore. You'll never be alone again. Promise, promise." He kissed the top of her head. "We're in this together now, Zelda. Whatever comes, we face it together." The first year of their marriage was hard work, but good work. Thomas quit his job at the Patterson Ranch and threw himself into building up their own place. He repaired the old corral, built it bigger and stronger. He bought 6 head of cattle with his savings, the start of what they hoped would become a proper herd. He planted a bigger vegetable garden, fixed every broken thing in and around the cabin, and built an addition so they'd have more space. Zelda worked alongside him, learning things she'd never known before. How to deliver a calf, how to treat a cow's infection, how to mend harnesses and repair saddles. Her hands, already tough from carrying water buckets, grew even more calloused. But now when she looked at them, she saw a partnership instead of lonely struggle. They fell into rhythms, into routines that felt like home. Morning coffee on the porch, watching the sun come up over the scrubland. Evening meals eaten at the table, talking about the day's work and making plans for tomorrow. Nights in each other's arms, the intimacy between them growing deeper and more comfortable. The well stood outside their door, a constant reminder of how they'd started. Sometimes Zelda would pause while drawing water and remember those endless walks to the creek, the weight of the buckets, the loneliness that had threatened to swallow her whole. And then she'd look around at the life they were building and feel grateful beyond words. In the spring, Zelda realized she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening after supper, just said it plain because she didn't know how else to say it. "I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop that probably carried all the way to town. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a madman, and Zelda laughed too, dizzy with joy and relief because she'd been a little scared he might not be ready. "A baby," he kept saying, setting her down carefully like she was made of glass. "We're having a baby. Zelda, we're having a baby. I know, are you happy?" "Happy, I'm beyond happy, I'm—" He couldn't seem to find the words, so he just kissed her instead, soft and sweet and full of wonder. The pregnancy was mostly easy, though the summer heat made Zelda miserable toward the end. Thomas was attentive to the point of being overprotective, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a coffee cup. She complained about it, but secretly she loved being taken care of, loved seeing how much he already loved their unborn child. On a cold December evening, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Zelda went into labor. Thomas rode like a demon to fetch Mrs. Henderson, who served as the town's midwife, and then paced outside the cabin like a caged animal while the older woman helped Zelda through the birth. It was long and hard and painful, and there were moments when Zelda thought she might die just like her own mother had. But Mrs. Henderson was experienced and calm, and just after midnight, Zelda heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby crying. "It's a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, wrapping the infant in a clean blanket. "A healthy, strong boy." Thomas was allowed back in, and he came to Zelda's side immediately, his face streaked with tears. "You did it. God, Zelda, you did it. We have a son." She took the baby from Mrs. Henderson, cradling him against her chest. He was red-faced and wrinkled and perfect. "Look at him, Thomas. Look at our son." Thomas touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and the infant immediately grasped it with surprising strength. "He's perfect. You're both perfect. Thank you. Thank you for this." They named him Samuel Thomas Walsh, Samuel after Zelda's father and Thomas for obvious reasons. Little Sam, as they quickly started calling him, was a good baby for the most part. He ate well, slept in reasonable stretches, and had his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair. Those first months were exhausting. Zelda was constantly feeding or changing or rocking the baby. Thomas took over even more of the ranch work, though he spent every spare moment with his wife and son. They were tired all the time, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from building something that mattered. On a warm spring evening when Sam was about 4 months old, Zelda was sitting on the porch nursing the baby while Thomas worked on fixing a saddle. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Zelda was hit with a wave of contentment so strong it almost hurt. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, looking up from his work. "How different my life is now compared to 2 years ago. How I was so alone, so tired, so close to giving up. And now look at us." Thomas set down the saddle and came to sit beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. "You wouldn't have given up. You're too stubborn for that, maybe. But I was close, I really was, and then you showed up and dug me a well. Best decision I ever made. Better than marrying me. That's the same decision. I dug the well because I was already falling for you. I just didn't realize it yet." Zelda leaned into him, the baby content at her breast, her husband's arms solid and warm around her. "I love you, Thomas Walsh. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I love you too. And I promise I'm not going anywhere. This is exactly where I want to be." The years rolled on, marked by small triumphs and occasional setbacks. Their cattle herd grew slowly but steadily. They added chickens, then a few pigs. They expanded the cabin again, building 2 more rooms so Sam would have his own space as he grew. Sam turned into a cheerful, energetic toddler who followed his father everywhere, mimicking his walk and trying to help with chores in ways that were more adorable than useful. Thomas was a patient, loving father, the kind who got down on the floor to play and never made his son feel like a burden. When Sam was 3, Zelda found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder, with more sickness in the early months and more aches and pains throughout. She was older now, 27, and her body didn't bounce back as easily. But Thomas was there every step of the way, holding her hair when she was sick, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings, taking over even more of the work so she could rest. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Mee Walsh, arrived on a perfect October morning in 1886. She was smaller than Sam had been, more delicate, with wispy blonde hair that looked nothing like either parent but apparently came from Thomas's mother. Sam was fascinated by his baby sister, wanted to hold her and help with her constantly. Under careful supervision, Thomas and Zelda led him, teaching him to be gentle to support her head. It was sweet watching their son become a big brother, watching the family they'd built expand and strengthen, but it wasn't always easy. The ranch demanded constant work. Money was often tight. There were droughts that withered the garden and killed grass the cattle needed. There were cold winters when they had to break ice in the water troughs every morning. There were times when Thomas and Zelda argued, usually about money or priorities, their voices sharp with stress and exhaustion. But they always came back together, always apologized and talked through the problem and remembered why they were doing all of this, for each other, for their children, for the life they'd chosen to build. When Clara was 2 and Sam was 5, a severe drought hit the region. For months, barely any rain fell. The creek that Zelda used to walk to twice a day dried up completely by July. Other homesteaders and ranchers were struggling, some giving up and moving away. Water was becoming the most precious commodity in the county, but the Walsh family had water. The well Thomas had dug still ran strong and deep, providing more than enough for them and their animals. Other people started coming by, asking if they could fill buckets from the well. Thomas and Zelda never turned anyone away, though some offered to pay and they accepted when they could. "This well is saving us," Zelda said one evening, watching Thomas draw up water for a neighbor's horse. "If you hadn't dug it, we'd be in the same desperate situation as everyone else." "I dug it for you," Thomas said simply. "But yeah, it's turned out to be a bigger blessing than I expected." The drought finally broke in September with a series of thunderstorms that turned the dry earth into mud and filled the creek beds with rushing water. The relief was palpable throughout the whole county. People celebrated, laughed, cried with gratitude. In the aftermath, Thomas and Zelda's ranch recovered faster than most because their cattle had stayed healthier, having always had enough water. They were able to buy a few more head of cattle from struggling neighbors at fair prices, expanding their herd significantly. It wasn't that they profited from others' misfortune, but they were in a position to help by buying animals that would otherwise die or be sold for slaughter. By 1890, the Walsh Ranch was modestly prosperous. They had a herd of about 40 cattle, a good number of chickens, several pigs, and 3 horses. The cabin had been expanded twice more and was now a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a sitting room. They'd built a barn and improved the corrals. The vegetable garden produced more than they could eat, and Zelda had learned to can and preserve food for the winter. Sam was 8 now, a sturdy boy who was already learning to ride and rope. Clara was 5, a bright, curious child who followed her mother around asking endless questions about everything. Watching her children grow, teaching them to read and write and work, filled Zelda with a satisfaction she'd never imagined possible back when she was alone and carrying water buckets. Thomas had aged well, a few lines around his eyes and some silver threading through his dark hair, but he was still strong and vital. He'd built a reputation in the county as a fair man, honest in his dealings, generous with his help. People respected him and, by extension, respected Zelda too. They'd become a true part of the Holbrook community. They attended church most Sundays, went to town gatherings and dances, had friends among the other ranch families. It was a far cry from the isolation Zelda had felt in those dark months after her father's death. Sometimes, on quiet evenings after the children were in bed, Thomas and Zelda would sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing. These were Zelda's favorite times, just the two of them, the way it had been in the beginning. "You remember the first time you came here?" Zelda asked one such evening. "You stood right over there by the well and offered to dig it for me. I remember. You looked at me like I was crazy or dangerous or both. Can you blame me? Strange man showing up and offering to do hard labor for free," Thomas laughed. "No, I suppose not. But I knew even then. I knew you were someone special, someone I wanted to know better. I thought you were too good to be true. I kept waiting for the catch, for the moment you'd demand something in return. And instead I just kept showing up, digging a hole in your yard." "Best hole anyone's ever dug," Zelda said, smiling. She reached over and took his hand. "You changed my life, Thomas. You saved me in so many ways. You saved me too. I was drifting before I found you, no purpose beyond the next job. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "I'd dig 1,000 wells if that's what it took to keep you. One was enough. One was perfect." As the years continued, the Walsh family thrived. Sam grew into a responsible young man who took pride in the ranch. Clara developed a love for animals and a talent for healing them, often nursing injured birds or helping deliver calves. In 1895, when Clara was 9 and Sam was 12, Zelda found herself pregnant once more, a surprise at 35 years old. This pregnancy was the hardest yet, and there were complications that scared both her and Thomas. But with the help of a doctor who'd recently moved to Holbrook and Mrs. Henderson's continuing support, Zelda delivered a healthy baby girl in early 1896. They named her Rose, and she was the sweetest-natured of their children, rarely crying, always content. Thomas, now in his early 40s, embraced fatherhood again with the same enthusiasm he'd shown with their first 2 children. He'd rock Rose for hours, singing softly, completely unbothered by the gray in his hair or the fact that he'd be in his 60s when she came of age. "I'm an old man with a baby," he joked one evening. "You're not old. You're seasoned," Zelda corrected, watching him dance slowly around the kitchen with Rose in his arms. "Seasoned like a cast-iron skillet, exactly like that, better with age." The turn of the century found the Walsh family well established. Their ranch was one of the more successful small operations in the area. Sam, at 17, was nearly a full partner in the work, making decisions and managing cattle sales. Clara, 14, had started helping the new doctor with sick animals and was talking about maybe becoming a veterinarian someday, though Thomas and Zelda weren't sure such a thing was possible for a woman. Rose, now 4, was the darling of the family, spoiled by her older siblings and adored by her parents. Zelda was 40 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined from years of sun and wind. But Thomas still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, still reached for her hand whenever they walked together, still kissed her goodnight every single evening. 20 years, Zelda said one November evening, the anniversary of their wedding. "We've been married 20 years. Best 20 years of my life," Thomas said, "though I hope we have at least 20 more." "At least," Zelda agreed. She looked around their home at the sturdy walls and comfortable furniture, at the photographs on the mantel showing their children at various ages. "Do you ever think about that first week, when you were digging the well?" "All the time. I think about how nervous I was, worried you'd send me away. How I'd look up from digging and see you watching from the window. How beautiful you looked when I hit water and you realized you'd never have to make that walk again. I hugged you. I got mud all over my dress. I didn't care about the mud. I cared that you were happy, that I'd done something to make your life better." Zelda moved to sit on his lap, something she still did sometimes when they were alone, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You made my life better in every possible way. The well was just the beginning." Thomas held her close, his face buried in her hair. "I love you, Zelda. I've loved you since the moment I saw you struggling with those buckets. I'll love you until the day I die. And I'll love you beyond that," Zelda whispered. "I'll love you forever." The years moved forward. Sam got married at 20 to a nice girl from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on the far edge of the Walsh property. Clara did become a veterinarian, studying with the doctor in Holbrook, and eventually taking over his practice when he retired. Rose grew into a thoughtful, artistic young woman who loved to paint the desert landscapes. Thomas and Zelda grew older together, their hair turning white, their bodies slowing down but their love remaining constant. They handed over more and more of the ranch work to Sam and his growing family, content to sit on the porch and watch the next generation build on what they'd started. The well still stood outside their door, maintained and cared for, still providing water to the family and anyone who needed it. It had become something of a local landmark, the well that the cowboy had dug for love. On a warm spring evening in 1910, when Zelda was 54 and Thomas 58, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, Sam's 3 children and Clara's twin boys. Rose was inside making supper, the smell of cooking meat and fresh bread wafting through the open windows. "This is what I dreamed of," Thomas said quietly. "Back when I was young and my parents died and I thought I'd be alone forever. This right here, this is what I dreamed of. Family, family, home, you, a place where I belong." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers the way they had thousands of times before. "Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on a drifter who showed up with a pickaxe and a fool's hope. You weren't a fool. You were exactly what I needed, what I didn't even know I needed." Zelda watched their grandchildren play, heard Rose humming in the kitchen, felt the solid weight of her husband's hand in hers. "We built something good, didn't we? We built something great." The sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and the Walsh family gathered for supper. There was laughter and talking, the comfortable chaos of multiple generations under one roof. And later, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Thomas and Zelda lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, holding each other the way they had for nearly 30 years. "I love you," Zelda whispered. "I love you too," Thomas answered. And outside their window, the well stood silent and strong, a testament to how a single act of kindness can change everything, how love can grow from the simplest gesture, how 2 lonely people can find each other in the vastness of the desert and build a life that matters. The years continued to roll by, measured in seasons and grandchildren's birthdays and small triumphs on the ranch. Thomas and Zelda grew older, their steps slower, their bodies wearing out the way bodies do, but their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, became richer, like wine aging in a barrel. By 1915, they were in their 60s, officially old by most standards. Sam ran the ranch now with his oldest son helping. Clara's veterinary practice served 3 counties. Rose had married a teacher from Flagstaff and moved there, though she visited often with her husband and their baby daughter. Thomas's health began to fail in 1916. He developed a cough that wouldn't go away, and the doctor diagnosed him with a lung condition, possibly from years of breathing in dust. He was prescribed rest, which Thomas hated, but he complied because Zelda insisted. She cared for him through that winter, making him herbal teas, reading to him, sitting beside his bed for hours just holding his hand. It was a reversal of their whole marriage, where he'd always been the one taking care of her, and Thomas struggled with it at first. "I'm supposed to be the one looking after you," he said one afternoon, his voice weak. "You've looked after me for 35 years. Let me look after you now. I don't want to be a burden." "Thomas Walsh, you could never be a burden, not to me, not in a million years." He got better with the spring, the warm weather easing his symptoms. They celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary in November, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a loud, joyful gathering, and Thomas laughed more than he had in months. That night, lying in bed, he said to Zelda, "If I die tomorrow, I'll die happy. I've had a good life, a full life because of you. You're not dying tomorrow or any time soon. I forbid it." "Yes, madam," he said, smiling in the darkness, but the next winter was harder. Thomas's condition worsened, and no amount of medicine or care seemed to help. By February, it was clear he was dying. The family gathered, everyone taking turns sitting with him, saying their goodbyes. Zelda stayed by his side almost constantly, leaving only when someone forced her to eat or rest. She held his hand, stroked his hair, told him stories of their life together. "You remember," she said one evening, her voice thick with tears, "the first time you kissed me. In the cabin after you finished the well, best kiss of my life," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mine too. All my best moments have been with you, Zelda." He squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. "Don't grieve too long, live, be happy. You've got years left, use them. I'll try, but it won't be the same without you. No, but it'll still be good. Promise me you'll find the good." "I promise." Thomas Walsh died peacefully in his sleep on a cold February night in 1917, surrounded by his family, Zelda's hand in his. He was 65 years old and had lived a life full of love and purpose. The funeral was well attended, people coming from all over the county to pay their respects to a man who'd been known for his fairness, his generosity, his devotion to his family. They buried him in the Holbrook Cemetery, not far from where Zelda's father lay. Zelda thought she might die from grief in those first weeks. The house felt empty without him, even with children and grandchildren constantly visiting. Her bed was cold. The mornings were lonely. Everything reminded her of Thomas, and the pain was nearly unbearable. But she'd made him a promise, and Zelda Kane Walsh had never been one to break promises. So she kept going. She got up every morning, drank her coffee, tended her garden. She played with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She helped Sam with ranch decisions, visited Clara at her practice, wrote long letters to Rose in Flagstaff. And slowly, painfully, she found a way to live without him. Not to move on exactly, because part of her heart would always be buried in that grave. But to keep living, to find moments of joy and peace, to honor his memory by not giving up. She lived another 8 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1925 at the age of 69. Her children gathered around her afterward, grieving but also celebrating a life well lived. They buried her next to Thomas, and the whole town came to the funeral just as they had for him. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Sam's line. The house was maintained, updated over the years but never torn down. And the famous well that the cowboy had dug for the woman he loved, remained in use for another 50 years until modern plumbing made it obsolete. But even after it was no longer needed for water, the family kept it maintained as a monument, a reminder of where they'd all come from. Generations of Walsh children played around it, heard the story of how their great-great-grandfather had dug it for their great-great-grandmother, how that single act of kindness had started everything. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting over the Arizona desert, if you stood by that well and listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of old love, of a man and a woman who'd found each other against all odds and built something that lasted far beyond their own lives. The well stood as proof that sometimes the most extraordinary things grow from the simplest acts of compassion, that love can bloom in the harshest environments, and that when you help someone in need, you might just be building your own future, one bucket of water at a time.